My wife and I are going through this new experience called grandparenting. And I understand now. I always wondered why grandparents were so enamored with their grandchildren. And they always want to show you pictures and do all this sort of thing. And I said, what happens that makes them go so screwy? And I can tell you what it is. My grandchildren worship me. They think I'm the greatest thing in the world. My children didn't think that, but they just think their granddad hung the moon. And it was last Christmas, and my daughter was there, and with the kids, and there was the 4-year-old and the 2-year-old and a newborn, and they liked their granddad, and the phone rang, and so I went off to answer the phone and closed the door. And my little 4-year-old granddaughter saw it, and brother, she jumped off and took off across the room. And when she did, her mother and her grandmother said, "Now you leave Granddad alone. You leave Granddad alone." It didn't slow her down a bit. She hit that door, bang. She said, "Granddad, it's me. It's me, Granddad. Granddad, it's me. It's Fane, Granddad. Granddad, it's me." She knew the heart of the person on the other side of that door, and that no further explanation was required. That if he only knew that it was me, that was all he would need to know. He would open that door, which I did. She leapt into my arms. I rescued her from those disciplinarians about to descend upon her. And I was laying in bed the next morning, and I heard her. Whenever they're with us, they always come in the morning and hop in the bed with their grandma and granddad. And I heard her coming down the hall, dragging her blanket. And I was thinking of this overwhelming love, this tremendous love that I have for this little thing that 48 months ago didn't even exist. And yet I love her to death, but here's the significance. It didn't subtract from the love that I have for her mother or her grandmother or anyone. Why is that? Because love is spiritual. And things that are spiritual cannot be diminished by their consumption. They cannot be measured. They cannot be weighed because they are spiritual. And the most important thing in life, I think, that we could learn is understanding that everything in life is either physical or spiritual. And wisdom is the capacity to distinguish which is which. A painting is physical, but the beauty that it gives off is spiritual. Leadership is spiritual. You give it to 5, 15, 15,000. You can't physically dominate leadership. That's not leadership. To understand what is physical and what is spiritual is the key. It was 1776. That summer in Philadelphia, the Americans had decided to do something that people had talked about and prayed about for 200 years. That is, once they started reading the Bible, and let me just give you a little aside, the Chinese had been world leaders for hundreds of years. Marco Polo discovered how to get there, and they got paper and dynamite and all the things spices that China had. And as you remember, when the Muslims came up and attacked the capacity for them between Europe and China to trade, then we learned in our history books that Columbus tried to find how to get east by sailing west. Now, we all had to learn that, but they left out why. And the reason was that the caravans were being attacked and they were taking everything. And thereafter, China sort of flatlined. And so a few years ago, they did a study. They did an 8-year study as to why is it that over the last 400 years, all of the invention and the creation and the art and the culture has come from Northern Europe and not China, as they've been the same since they were in the 1400s. And what had transpired? And after a great deal of study, they came up with 3 conclusions. Number 1 was the printing press. so that people could read. You didn't have to be wealthy to have a handwritten book as you did for hundreds of years. Number two was the translation of the scriptures into modern language, which was the Gutenberg Bible, the Geneva Bible, and then as the rest of it was taken off for the King James. And thirdly was the Protestant Reformation, that man was individually accountable to God. And those three things made it such that where that Bible went, there was this great change that took place. Now, that's what they concluded, and quite frankly, you can't argue with that. You can see how it works. And when a man doesn't want to discuss about God, then they get to the point where they can't explain it, so they don't discuss it. But in America, in 1776, they decided that idea, they've been reading the Bible, and the Bible said that we are individually accountable to God. That was the Reformation. We didn't have to go through people. We could directly speak to God. Well, if I don't have to go through someone to get to God, why do I have to go through someone to run my government? And that's caused King James a little bit of concern. And so, as you know, he began to assert himself, and so people became covenanters. That is, they took a covenant. We have no king but Jesus. And there in Edinburgh at the Greyfriars Chapel there is the covenant where they signed, and just at the bottom of the hill is where the gallows were. And when they were chased out, they went over to Netherlands, and then they came here. They were called Puritans because they were going to stay pure to the Bible. They were going to Virginia, which would have been under English law. They were accidentally blown off course, landed at Mayflower. There was no law, and so they took the scriptures, and they had the Mayflower Compact. And from that, they began to create this nation. By the way, it's estimated that 70% of all of the commanders in the Revolutionary War were covenanters, those that had committed to have no king but Jesus. And George III said, he didn't call it the American Revolution. He said, who shall deliver me from this Scottish, 39 of the 59 signers, that's where the Scots came, who shall deliver me from this Scottish Presbyterian Revolution? He knew that this was a spiritual battle. And so, as they had the fight in the summer of 1776, an estimated 25 to 45,000 troops, 20,000 volunteers, 25,000 regulars, and as they had the various skirmishes with the largest army in the world, things didn't go well, and they lost, and they lost, and they lost, and they lost, and finally they were able to escape across the river there in New York, and they made it to Pennsylvania, and then they're there in the snow outside Philadelphia at Valley Forge. And they knew that it wasn't going good. George Washington wrote a note to his cousin who was running the farm at Mount Vernon. He said, I fear this thing is about up. And so Benjamin Rush, who was a believer and a sort of a prayer partner of George Washington's, he was a doctor. He came down from New York, and they prayed and decided they had to have a victory of some sort. And so Benjamin Rush said, let's have as our watchword, victory or death. This is it. Because now it's Christmas time. The troops had diminished down to 7,500, of whom only 2,400 could march. The other 5,000 were too ill to even stand up and participate. And they were hanging on for one reason. Because on January 1st, their enlistment was up. And if they could just survive another week, it was all over. George Washington, being a leader, knew that we have to do something. We've got to have a victory. And so they went through the troops to find out how many of them could stand with them. They said, here's what we're going to do. We're running out of food. We've run out of money. The Congress there at Philadelphia, they wrote him a note and said, it's too dangerous for us to stay around here. We're leaving. Good luck, George. And so he has no money, he has no food, he has no supplies. But they know that down across the Delaware River in Trenton are some well-supplied mercenaries. And they decide that they're going to attack them on Christmas Day. And so they decide to go. And George Washington said this on the night when they're about to go. He said, post none but Americans on guard tonight. You see, being an American is not physical. You and I can't become Japanese or Chinese, but anybody can become an American because American is spiritual. You say, post-num, but well, what do you mean? Well, they've all got birth certificates, and you're going to tell me that's not it. I don't care how many birth certificates you got. That doesn't make you an American, son. There's certain things that make you an American. And they went down and across the river. Their shoes collapsed, were worthless, fell apart. They had frozen, and they wrapped them in burlap. They said you could follow the soldiers by the blood in the snow. They intended to cross the river at midnight, attack at dawn. By 9 the next morning, they're still trying to get across it. Absolutely horrendous, horrendous, horrendous snowstorm, sleet, and ice. They attacked, captured over 900 soldiers, had a tremendous victory, got the food and supplies necessary for them to not only make it through the summer, but make it through the winter, but the tremendous spiritual uplift. Momentum is spiritual. You can't quantify it. The enthusiasm that went throughout the colonies was such that it changed the course. And with only the loss of 2 soldiers, both of whom froze to death on the march. That gave birth to the nation. They had a document in which they said, we're going to have a starting point, and we're going to do something different from any other nation. We're going to use a foundation that is true. We hold these truths. Truth is an important word. I can say that this platform is 18 feet wide. You can say it's 16. Somebody else say it's 21. Somebody say it's 19. If we measure it, that measurement is truth, and everything else is just opinion. Christ said, I am the truth. And everything else is just opinion. Therefore, once we have truth, and I say it's 19 feet long, and it's only 18, then it's revealed that I'm in error. And I don't like that. Man doesn't like that. So man wants to do away with truth. And if he can do away with truth, then there is no standard. And I can say and do anything that I want. And that's only been that way since Adam and Eve in the garden. That's the fight. Lucifer, I shall ascend into the throne. I shall be like the Most High. There is a battle as to who's going to be on the throne. When man is on the throne, spiritual, physical. Man claims that he wants life, claims that he wants love, claims that he wants joy. They did a poll. What's the purpose of man? Number 3, it came back, the whole purpose of man was to achieve peace. The things that man wants, love and joy and peace. The scriptures say, which we have the truth, the standard. Let's just back up just a bit. If I quote a person, if I say it or you quote it, the word is what matters, not how it's delivered over a microphone or if it's written. That's the same. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. The same was in all things were made by him. Without him was not anything made that was made. Jesus Christ is the Word, is the cornerstone. Everything else is just ordinary opinion. And from that, you have truth. So, if I want to pray at an inaugural, I can pray in the name of anything in the world. I can pray in the name of eagle feathers, and I can pray in the name of all, and no one will be offended. But if I pray in the name of Jesus Christ, all hell will break loose. Why? Because Satan knows that's truth. And our founders wanted it dependent upon truth. Now, one of the significant things about the difference between physical and spiritual is you cannot achieve spiritual ends with physical tools. You can only make a fool out of yourself by trying. That's a lack of wisdom. I want to be happy. And so therefore, if I get a new boat, I get a new airplane, that's physical, but it won't do that. Let's explain it this way. You cannot achieve physical ends with spiritual tools. So we want to build a new building. Let's go out in the field. We're going to have love, and we're going to have joy, and we're going to have peace and long-suffering and gentleness and goodness. Well, you won't get a building because that's spiritual. You cannot achieve physical ends with spiritual tools. You cannot achieve spiritual ends with physical tools. And if you listen to a person, you can tell whether or not they're enlightened, because they think, if you just shoot this, or you just drink this, or you smoke this, you'll be at peace. It'll bring you peace. You cannot get peace is spiritual. You can't do anything physically to achieve peace. You think, love, joy, have joy. If I just get a new kitchen, I'll be joy. No, you won't. No, you won't, because it's spiritual. And that's the source of our nation. Our founders said, we understand, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created. That's the starting point. Thomas Jefferson said, in all disquisitions, arguments of every kind, there are certain primary truths or first principles upon which all subsequent reasoning must begin. There's a starting point, and from that, everything else will work. If I'm going to build a building, all I need is one stake, any place on the lot. I just need it someplace. And from that, I can gear off of it. There has to be a cornerstone. There has to be a starting point. There has to be a truth. Now, if I build the footers and somebody moves that stake, when I go to put the first floor on, then the whole thing starts to come apart. Then I go to the second floor and I move it 18 and say, marriage is between 3 men and 2 women. And then they move it back here, marriage between 5 men. See, there's only 2 worldviews. Only 2. One is what God says, and the other is what man says. And our founders nailed it. We don't want it to be arbitrary. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator. Not by a 5-4 vote to the Supreme Court. Not by a majority. You see, America is not a democracy. Can I give you that just for a couple of minutes? In a democracy, the rights come from the majority. My daughter just spent over a year in Rwanda. In Rwanda, 80% of the people are Hutu and 20% are Tutsi. The 80% voted to kill the 20%, and in the course of 90 days with machetes, they killed over 1 million people. That's a democracy. That's where the rights come from the majority. Our rights don't come from the majority. Our rights come from God. And it says in our birth certificate that to secure these rights, to maintain them, governments are instituted among men. So this is what government does. The purpose of government is to protect the rights that God gave them. So if you vote 98-2 to kill Jews in America, you can't do it. Why? Because what are the rights? The rights are life. Life, that's number 1. You don't need to know a whole lot more about who to vote for. Life is the crossroads. Life is the fork in the roads. Did anybody see the movie God Is Not Dead? Have you? And Hercules was the actor, Kevin Sorbo. And we were out to dinner the other night, and Kevin and Sam are good friends, he and his wife, and he was talking about he's working on this movie, and his co-star is a liberal, naturally. And she always made these little asides to him about being a right-wing extremist and all the things that the tolerant people call us. And so he said he'd planned this, that they were in makeup together. And he said he's reading the newspaper, and he said, this fella got 7 years for destruction of turkey eggs. And she said, well, they should have killed him. And he said, well, why is that? Well, because those eggs could have been turtles someday. They could have been turtles someday, and he killed them all. And he said, I just took my paper and went. He said, I didn't say a word. because those little eggs could have been turtles someday, and he's responsible for having killed them. And he just looked at her like that. And he said, so finally she got up, she ripped it off and went storming off. She said she got about 50 feet away, and she just stopped and screamed, "You're wrong!" He hadn't said a word. He had not said a word. But the principle of what I am come that you might have life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. He that hath the Son hath life. Now, to separate God out, what do you get? You get man's way. Sin is anything that separates us from God. And so these politicians that want to take God out of the pledge, and they want to do all these things, they want to separate us from God. And that's called sin. Sin is anything. And the wages of sin, when it goes to pay off, the wages of sin is death. Sin, when it is conceived, bringeth forth death. There is a way that seems right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. And so we have this life and death struggle. And America decided it was going to stand on the side of life, such that a Jew could be chased any place around the globe. If they could just get under the canopy of protection of the American flag, they knew they were going to be safe because America protected life. Let me give you a little aside. I speak on occasion with my friend Daniel Lappin, and he is a rabbi that has immigrated from Africa, and so he can speak more boldly, and he speaks in these various synagogues. And his closing story that he gives is that he tells these folks, he said, suppose that you're out after curfew in Warsaw during the Nazi occupation, and the Nazi boots are gaining on you. And you turn down the street, and you have time to only knock on one door, and on a series of townhouses on both sides of the street. And over one door, it says a composer, another one says a doctor, another one says an engineer, and the other one says a Baptist Sunday school teacher, and another one says a mayor. And you only have time to knock on one door. On which door will you knock? Then he stops and walks around for a while, and finally stops and looks at him. He says, you know which door you'd knock on. You'd knock on that Baptist Sunday school teacher's door. Why? Because that person believes in God. If they believe in God, they would respect life. If they respect life, a Jew might be safe. And he walks around a bit more. He says, by the way, I didn't make that up. That is exactly what happened. Jews were being chased from all over the world. And they turn down the street, and they can only knock on one door. Over one door says Argentina, another one says Brazil, another one says China, one says United States of America, one says Belgium, and one says Argentina. And on which door do you knock? You knock on the American's door. Why? Because they believe in God. If they believe in God, they will respect life. If they respect life, then a Jew would be safe. And so what do? You knock on their, and what do? They invite you in. And what is the first thing you do? You come storming in the house, and you rip down the crucifix off the wall. You sue them for having a cross on the city seal. You demand they take under God out of the pledge. And you do everything humanly possible to turn that country into the place from which you've just escaped. And he said, and quite frankly, you're doing a pretty good job of it. He said, but when you're done, and America no longer respects God and becomes just like every place else, there will be no respect for life. And when there's no respect for life, anybody who knows anything about history at all knows this. They always kill Jews first. And with that, he turns and walks off the stage. So, America is unique because it was committed to God, protection of life. Now, where does the democracy come in? Why do these politicians always talk about democracy? Well, we have a Republican form of government. It's guaranteed in the Constitution. The word democracy does not appear in any of our founding documents. They were scared to death of it because they were having, at the same time that they were writing the Constitution, they were having a revolution in France, and it was a democratic revolution. That is where the majority took control, and they took the rich people, put their heads on a pike. The symbol of the French Revolution was the guillotine, and they sounded like Bernie Sanders speaking, or whatever. We're going to get that top 1%, we're going to take them over and all that, and said, so we don't want that to happen. So America was formed for the purpose of the preservation of life, then liberty, Notice the sequence. You have to have life. Liberty is no good if you're dead. So you have to have life first, life, then liberty. And when you listen to a politician, you can tell quickly where he comes down. Now that comes to us. This has now been lovingly handed to us. And it's our opportunity to either preserve it or to allow it to disappear. Another story I don't have time for. Let me just close by saying this. As Tim mentioned, half of people who are identified as evangelicals, those are people that are, the pollsters refer to, believe the Bible is the Word of God, have had a personal relationship with Christ, and attend church an average of 4 times a month. So there would be people such as some Catholics or others that would not identify as such, but nevertheless. Of those, there's an estimated 80 to 85 million Americans. 55 million votes elects 50 governors, 435 House members, 100 senators, and the President of the United States. What's the problem? The problem is that half of them are not registered to vote. That means that they never vote at all. Now, it's very complicated to register. You have to know your name, your birth date, and your residence. Unless you're from Chicago, and you don't need to know those. Half of them are not registered. Of those that are registered, half of them do not vote. And on non-presidential years, half of those do not vote, so we're 1/4. So let me just tell you this. Politicians know that Christians are no threat because they're really not going to show up. We'll pray for you, brother. And let me just explain. Suppose you're sitting on an airplane and the person on your left turns to you and they say, what is it you do? And you say, well, I'm a minister of the gospel. Oh, that's wonderful. Oh, I think that's so good. Spirituality is an important thing. I think we need more spirituality. You know, my son's out there in California. He has these crystals and things, and I don't know how they work, but it seems to help him. And you know, all roads lead to the same place, and we're all just different roads to the same way. And anybody's committed to that, I just think it's a wonderful thing. That's really wonderful what you do. Now she thinks she's paid you a compliment. But in truth, she's revealed she doesn't have a clue what she's talking about. And so you turn to the person next to you and you say, well, sir, what is it you do? And he said, well, I'm a United States Senator. Oh, that's wonderful. You know, I think it's really great that we have good people that dedicate their lives to public service. That is so good. And, you know, and I don't vote on party. I'm telling you, I don't do anything about that. There's all good people. There's good people on both sides, you know. It's like when I played for the basketball team. There's good people on the red team and red. They're all good players. Just throw the ball to anybody because they're all, you know, we're all trying to accomplish the same thing. And so therefore, I just vote for whoever's a good person. And I know you're all doing the right thing. And I just vote for the man. You think you've paid him a compliment, but he knows you don't have a clue what you're talking about. One party is dedicated to slavery for 100 years. When it was taken away, and then imposed a thing called Jim Crow, where they attacked people based upon their skin color. It took 50 years to get rid of that. Finally, we put a stop to that, and now they've gone off after life. It was bad enough to take people's liberty. Now they'll literally take people's physical lives. Innocent life. Another side is committed to protection of life and liberty. And now it's been entrusted to us. As a little aside for young people, when I was in my 20s, it looked as though the country was washed up. It looked like we were finished. We elected a president who apologized at everything he did. Everything we did was wrong. And he went over there, and the closest friend we ever had was the Shah of Iran. When Israel had in the war in 1973, when Israel had its Air Force destroyed in the first 6 hours of the battle, back in those days, Golda Meir, the prime minister, was calling the president and asking for help. President Nixon, back in those days, the president had to abide by a thing called the Constitution, and he didn't have a right to go to war on his own, and so he couldn't help, and so he asked the closest friend America ever had. There were times we got as low as 8 votes in the United Nations. Iran was always with us. we had sold the same jets that Israel had to Iran. And they asked Iran if he would give his Air Force to Israel, which he did at the request of the United States, with no promise of replacement or remuneration, and turned the battle so that Israel survived. And the Shah of Iran sealed his fate with those radical Muslims that were set out to destroy him. But nevertheless, he cast his arms with the United States. He could trust America. But we elected this peanut farmer from Georgia. And he came in there and he said he wanted to overthrow the Shah. So we think the Shah should step down. First of all, he said in diplomatic terms, we do not know whether or not the Shah can survive, which said to the whole world, the United States is not going to stand with it, have at him. And so they did everything possible to try to destroy him, throw people out of work, and create all kinds of turmoil. They said, well, who's going to take over? He said, well, we think Khomeini might be a saint. And so they overthrew that peacock throne that had been there since Daniel in the scriptures, the longest monarchy in the history of mankind, could survive 2,700 years, but couldn't survive the Carter administration. So from that, economically, he said that we couldn't have gasoline. We would put a tax and regulation. You couldn't produce any more gas. And you won't believe this, but you couldn't buy gas. I was elected in November of 1980. We drove back and forth to Washington, my wife and I, 6 times between then and January. We know there was not a single filling station between here and Washington, D.C. that was open after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. If you didn't have a full tank of gas by 3 o'clock, you weren't going anyplace. And inflation was at 18%. Interest rates, if you wanted to buy a house, 22%. America was in a state of collapse. And they told us, this is what you got to look forward to. Got to learn to live with less. Wear your sweater, ride your bicycle. America's coming to an end next Tuesday a week, and anything anybody can do about it. That's the head of the Council of Economic Advisors. This is America's chief cheerleader in 1980. He talked about the decade of the 80s. He said the question is not whether or not America will have a declining standard of living in the 1980s. The question is whether or not Americans can learn to adapt to their declining standard of living. More countries went communist under the Carter administration than any president since Truman. All of Africa was going. Over 27 countries were communist. They had a conference on African unity. They brought Leonid Brezhnev, the head of the Soviet Union, come to speak, and he said this. He said, because of what we, the Soviet Union, are doing, by the end of this decade, 1989, he said, by the end of this decade, we, the Soviet Union, will be able to work our will any place on the planet because the correlation of forces, economic, military, and political, are on the side of socialism and communism. It's finished. America's getting beat in every form. Well, this 70-year-old actor from California said, nonsense. He went on television the election night. John Wayne had just died, and his face was on the cover of Time magazine. He said, John Wayne was a friend of mine. I knew John Wayne very, very well. We were good buddies. And on that cover of Time magazine, it said, John Wayne, America's last hero. He said no one would be more offended at that than John Wayne, America's last hero. He said there's nothing wrong with America that proper leadership can't cure. And so he took office, cut taxes so people could save and invest and create jobs again, took all those regulations on gasoline, threw them in the Potomac, killed the fish, freed the country. When we drove home into Hillsboro, Ohio, 11 o'clock at night, my wife was asleep on the seat. We drove in downtown, 11 o'clock at night, there in the town square, 3 filling stations all lit up at the same. I woke her up. I said, had we not won, that wouldn't have happened. Over the next 8 years, 3 out of every 4 jobs created on this planet were created in one country, the United States of America. And by 1989, in Moscow and in Warsaw and Nicaragua, around the world, they're chanting USA, USA, USA. Leadership makes a difference. We're at the threshold. If America continues on this road for another 4 years, I fear for its future. We are 1 vote away on the Supreme Court. Ted Cruz took the case to the Supreme Court to defend the cross in the Mojave Desert that was not Mojave Desert, yes it is, the World War I memorial that had a cross. And they sued that a cross could not be on public property. And They won that case 5-4. 4 justices said, under no circumstances is a religious symbol to be permitted on public property. We are 1 vote away from taking sandblasters to every gravestone in this county. Once they've created a right for 3 men to marry, and you disapprove of it, you are violating that person's rights. They then can come in and take away your accreditation for your Christian school. They can arrest your school teacher for teaching something in violation of that person's rights. Unless we correct this thing immediately, that will become the future of our nation, the opposite of what our founders had in mind. And even the very possession of arms. In the Second Amendment, we thought it was secure. In the Heller case, argued by Ted Cruz, it was won by 5-4. 4 justices said individuals have no right in America to possess a defense weapon. 1 vote away. 1 vote away. This 85 million people, we could smash them like a gnat. All we have to do is just show up. We don't have to fight in the snow. We don't have to bleed to death. We don't have to get blown apart on the cliffs at D-Day. All we have to do is to make sure that we're registered and take people with us to elect the people. Bottom line is this. It's not original with me, by the way. The scripture says, well, I will give you one saying. Let me tell you what happens in this battle, unless you think it's by accident. Remember what I said about truth and God being truth? Harvard was designed to create ministers of the gospel. So what would be the slogan for Harvard University? It would be the Latin term for truth, veritas. They recently chose a new president, a woman, of course, as all colleges are doing now. And let me give you a couple sentences from her inaugural address. The veritas, the truth that's written on the seal of the veritas in Harvard's shield, was originally intended to invoke the absolutes of divine revelation, the unassailable verities of Puritan religion. So they're not stupid. They know what it meant. Next sentence. We understand it quite differently now. Truth is an aspiration, not a possession. Yet in this we and all universities defined by the spirit of debate and free inquiry challenge. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's liberty. You take away the Spirit of the Lord, man's in charge, you're in trouble. Because man's law is tyranny, and you have no protection without God. In her next sentence, she says this, and all universities defined by the spirit of debate and free inquiry challenge and threaten those who would embrace unquestioned certainties. Wow. We threaten you if you believe in truth. We must commit ourselves to the uncomfortable position of doubt, to the humility of always believing there is more to know, more to teach, more to understand, unless you actually have the truth, and we're not going to tolerate that. Wow. And so, throughout history and today, the Word says that righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked beareth rule, the people mourn. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord.
Wow. Was that worth coming tonight for? Amen. Every time he speaks, everybody says to me afterward, when's he going to run for president? Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? Bob's making a great influence, and I appreciate him so very much. We've got much more to come for you tomorrow. You don't want to miss a moment. We're only going to be here till 2, probably get you out a little early. So if you show up at 9 o'clock, we're going to start off right then. And we're not going to stop until we're done. We're going to eat as we go. We'll have the lunch brought in, nice box lunch from Chick-fil-A. And you're going to hear from J.C. Church tomorrow. You're going to hear from Phil Burris tomorrow. You're going to hear from Gary Frazier. You're going to hear from Tom Minery tomorrow. And you don't want to miss that. Also, Jim Garlow and the Benham brothers will be with us, and they're going to be sharing as well. This is an amazing thing. This year is my 20th year of ministry full-time. Prior to that, I had a career in retail merchandising. God delivered me from that and thrust me into ministry. And so much has changed. 20 years ago, no one would disagree that marriage is between a man and a woman. No one. In fact, if I said anything else, they'd say, well, sure. Now, if you talk about it, you're hateful and you're uncaring. The same is true of truth. The same is true of life and many other issues. God has entrusted us with this moment in time. And this Worldview Conference is about equipping us and encouraging us and sending us forth to be salt and light to impact culture with a biblical worldview. I sent a picture up. Jerry, did you grab that picture? Did you get that? And did you pop it? Yeah. I want you to look at that. Bob pulled the grandchildren out on you, so I'm going to throw mine at you too. That's my granddaughter and my grandson looking out the window. And when my daughter sent me that picture, I teared up because I thought, those kids are going to know whether I've done the right thing 20 years from now. They're going to know whether you and I have been faithful to the task God's entrusted to us to be salt and to be light, to be a influence, a godly influence in culture, or if we have not been. And I cannot fathom them looking at me and asking me why I didn't do something. God has entrusted not just their future, but many futures to us in this moment. And what we do, our effectiveness, our efforts will last long beyond us. May we be faithful. May we be willing to do all that we can while we can, using biblical wisdom and looking at life and approaching our task with the power of God in our lives. Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for joining us. Be back here tomorrow at 9 o'clock. We're looking forward to a great day with you. God bless you. Thank you for coming.